Welcome to Rex's Bible Minute, a weekly video where we talk about Jesus, Christianity, and anything along those lines. We are in week 13 of our study of the letters of John, which means we're not studying the Gospel of John or the Revelation of John, that really long, scary book at the end of the Bible. We're talking about John's really short letters, 1 John, 2 John, and 3 John. These all three were written by the Apostle John, the guy that Jesus said, hey, take care of my mom, which means somebody Jesus trusted. He was there for everything during Jesus' ministry. He's one of the three of Jesus' disciples that he kind of considered his closest circle, like his closest, I wouldn't call them advisors, but the three he relied on the most. And John is in his old age at this point. He has lived a hard life, but one that is very blessed. He started out as one of the pillars after Jesus' death and resurrection, as one of the leaders of the church in Jerusalem. And then if you study world history, you know that there was a pretty big war that happened in that region in the middle of the first century. And so John and a lot of Christians left that region, and they went and settled in southwestern Turkey, a really important place in the Roman Empire at this time, like a real center for culture and religion and commerce. And so John is writing in there, and this is a place where they've already had one falling away, and John is kind of leading one of the first great revivals. Like after Paul left the area, probably 30, 40 years earlier, they kind of pulled away from the doctrine, the theology that the apostles and Jesus taught, and started going off to these weird offshoots. And when a lot of these Christians from Judea moved to the area, started a great revival, going back to the doctrine, the things of God that Jesus and the apostles taught. And so John is leading this movement. He's, he was one of the guys, so everybody's traveling to come see him and talk to him. And he's also he's concerned. He's fighting against the issues that he's seeing. And so the issues that he's seeing, again, are, the early beginnings of Gnosticism, this secret knowledge. That word Gnostic means knowledge. Gnosis is the original word. And it just means that the people who say, hey, I've got this secret knowledge. And it almost played out as this weird combination of the Plato theology, philosophy that was really popular in the culture at that time, and it boiled down to flesh is bad, spirit is good. It usually took some form of this life is just, something we got to get through till we get to the other side and we live in the good life, May sound familiar to some Christians, but the idea that this life, flesh is bad and spirit is good. And so they kind of melded that idea with saying, hey, Jesus wasn't really flesh because flesh is bad. So, and there's just, so you hear John talk a lot about Jesus was the Messiah in the flesh. To our ears, it's like, why are you emphasizing that he was in the flesh? But it's because it was something that was pulling people away from true Christianity. Because if Jesus wasn't fully human, then his death and resurrection mean nothing. It had to be a perfect, flawless human do that, one who never broke the law. Only Jesus could do that because he was both fully human and fully God. So he's writing to combat that and to basically save souls. People who are turning to this are worshiping a Jesus that never existed. They're worshiping a God that never existed. It's a false religion. It's a false Christianity. So John's very forward about it, and he's very blunt about it, but he's also very elegant in the way he presents the arguments. And so let's get in this. We're going to be starting verse 7 and go through verse 13 and finish this whole letter. Honestly, you should be able to read the whole letter in one sitting, but there's a lot to it. John's writing style is very, very dense and very repetitive. Each paragraph is really worthy of just stepping back and going, okay, what did he say here, right? So let's read this and we'll break it down. Starting in verse 7, it says, many deceivers, you see, have gone out into the world. These are people who do not admit that Jesus the Messiah has come in the flesh. Such a person is the deceiver. And your translation probably has the word deceiver or Satan or devil, and it's usually capitalized. So we're talking about the guy here, right? The anti-Messiah, the Antichrist. Watch out for yourselves so that you won't lose what we have worked for, but may receive the full reward. Anyone who goes out on their own and does not abide in the teaching of the Messiah does not have God. One who abides in the teaching, such a one has the Father and the Son. So think about that for a second. If you teach these things that go against the core doctrinal theology that Jesus and the apostles taught, the salvation-related things, we're not talking about the peripheral things where we're allowed to have our opinions on, the core things, you get that wrong. John says you're separated from God. You do not have God. You do not have Jesus. And so there's big stakes here, right? Okay, we're going to talk about that more in a second. Continues on. He says, if anyone comes to you and does not bring his teaching, don't receive them into the house. Don't even give them a greeting. Anyone who utters a greeting to such a person shares in their wicked deeds. We're going to talk a lot about these two verses. Verse 12, I have many things to write you, but I did not wish to write with pen and ink. I am hoping instead to come to you and speak face to face. That will complete our joy. The children of your chosen sister send you greetings. Now, if you missed last week, that last line would probably be confusing. But John's writing in a time when everybody's expecting Christians to be widely persecuted because it's not too much time removed from when Nero basically unleashed a brutal persecution of Christians in the city of Rome. It wasn't empire-wide. It was just in the city of Rome, but he did awful things to them. And Christians were already incredibly unpopular. They were viewed as unpatriotic. And so everybody was expecting it to come. And so Christians started writing in code. So last week we saw that he addressed his audience as the chosen lady or and so it's a church, basically. The lady, the sisters, they're churches. So he's writing from his perspective to a church. And last week he talked about how he came across some sons of this chosen lady, members of that church. And in the end, his greeting here, he's saying the children, the members of my church, this chosen sister, send you greetings, right? So he's just writing in spy language, basically, to try to protect. I don't know that it would actually work, but, it was worth, every little layer of protection he could get. Try to make it look like a family letter. So the big question here, right? The thing that John brings up that we need to deal with, he's essentially spelling out what are the limits of Christian fellowship. So should we shun the non-believer? Like, should we just completely be gone with people who claim to be Christian but we disagree with them? Should we just be tolerant of everybody's ideas? Like, what are we supposed to do with people who claim to be Christian but either teach something or live in a way that goes against what Jesus and the apostles taught? How do we deal with that? And this is something that isn't unique to John's time. It's something that we absolutely should know the right way and the wrong way to deal with this, and should be informed on it. Like this is one of those things that as a Christian, you should not be just putting your head in the sand. You can't I don't know what I feel. Like, no, this is something you should understand. This is highly important because this happens a lot today. As a matter of fact, it determines who you listen to as spiritual advisors, preachers, teachers. Who are you listening to? Should you be listening to them? I mean, honestly, should you be supporting some of these ministries? Like, it's a big deal to pay attention to this. I mean, there's a lot of people out there who, on those core doctrines, teach things that go against what Jesus taught. Things that Jesus was fully man, that Jesus is God, that he has no beginning, he was not a created being. There are a lot of branches of people that claim to be Christians, like Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses, who teach things that go directly against what Jesus taught. Things like Jesus was an angel, that he was a created being, or that he was, him and Satan were just equal brother. Like crazy stuff that go directly against Jesus. We have to have an opinion on that, and we have to know how to treat people who claim to be Christian, but aren't, for lack of a better term. But even more so, people who live in intentional sin, people who are intentionally living and aiming for standards that are below God's. We have to live our lives as Christians aiming for the standards God sets for everything. You hit the target below God's standards. You miss the bullseye that God sets, you are sinning. Our job as Christians is to aim for those bullseyes as best we can. We're going to miss, and grace covers that. But the point is that we are trying to hit those bullseyes. If you are intentionally aiming at a different target, that places you outside of God's family. That places you outside of salvation. Judgment Day, you will not be part of God's people, and that is a terrifying thing. That means an eternity spent separated from God, never fulfilled, never being what you were created to be, always feeling empty, always feeling like something is missing, let alone the descriptions we have of the place that goes. It's very violent and painful, but my point is not to scare you into that. The point is to show you the stakes of getting this right. We have to get theology right, the core ones. We have to spell out what is sin and what isn't sin, These are things that have eternal consequences, not just Sunday morning consequences. If somebody's intentionally sinning, and let me make sure I'm crystal clear on this, right? There's a difference between somebody intentionally sin and somebody struggling but trying, right? As long as somebody is trying to remove sin from their life, they're trying to aim for God's standards, and they fail, like an addict. If an addict fails over and over and over, but they are trying, genuinely trying, then they're still in God's good graces. They're still in right standing with God. But if they're just like, forget it, like that's when they've crossed that line back out of salvation. So as long as somebody is intentionally trying to hit God's target, there's grace for every fail, because every Christian fails. Don't you think that just because you're a Christian, you can go 20 minutes without sinning in word or deed or action, right? Don't think you can go 20 minutes without thinking a sinful thought, failing to act when you should. All these things are sins. They're failing in the standards that God sets for every aspect of your life. So my point here is to say that we have to be trying, not that we will be perfect, because we won't be. But the issue that we face here, and when this becomes applicable, is you have somebody who's saying, hey, Jesus isn't what the church teaches he is. Jesus isn't a fully man. Jesus was a created being. Jesus was just an angel. When you run into that, when you run into these core doctrinal issues that you either are worshiping a false God or you're worshiping the true Jesus, like that issue. And when you run into people who are intentionally sinning, they're living in sin on purpose, and yet they claim to be Christian, how do we deal with that? Well, to get into that, let's look at some outside sources before we look at what John says. John's letter is very short and concise. And so he's building on top of teaching that his audience would have already had. Teachings from Paul, teachings from Jesus, from the Gospels. So let's look at those before we look at John's application of those teachings, right? The first one we're going to look at, it comes from 1 Corinthians. And if you're not familiar with 1 Corinthians, it was written by Paul. And this was a church that he started largely. And it was a church that was messed up. Like, they had a lot of issues pretty much on every front. Like, you had people doing things that were awful. You had people treating each other awfully. You had roles being confused. You had priorities being messed up, like everything. This church had issues. And one of the things he had to deal with was, how do you deal with those people who messed up and don't want to get back to being right? Those people who are teaching things that are wrong. How do you deal with them? This church had to know how to do this well, or else it would not survive at all. And so in chapter 5, verse 10, he spells out who we're actually talking about. And this is highly, highly important. He says in chapter 5, verse 9, he says, I wrote to you in the previous letter not to become associated with immoral people. I didn't, of course, mean immoral people in the world at large, or greedy people, or thieves, or idolaters. To avoid them, you'd have to remove yourself from the world altogether. This is crazy important. Paul and John and Jesus are not telling us to separate from the world. We can't hold the world, people who are not Christians, who don't claim to follow Jesus, to Jesus' standards, because they can't do it. There's no reason to expect them to. We can't do it, right? We can't do it, and we can't even come close without the Holy Spirit's help. And so you can't look at outsiders, people who don't know Jesus, who don't have the Holy Spirit dwelling within them, and expect them to stay to these standards. They're going to be thieves and liars and drunks and bigots and all these things. Like, that's not what any of the apostles or Jesus were talking about when they were talking about what we're looking at today. Continuing on verse 11, he says, no, I was referring to people who call themselves Christians, but who are immoral. People who are greedy or idolaters or blasphemers or drunkards or robbers. You shouldn't associate with them. You shouldn't even eat with a person like that. Why should I worry about judging outside people? It's the people inside you should judge, isn't it? God judges the outside people. So drive out the wicked person from your company. And he continues on and explains it further a little later in the chapter, in the book. He says in verse 10, if any one of the unbelievers invites you to dinner, go out with them and eat whatever's put in front of you without making any judgments on the basis of conscience. So Paul is saying, when I was talking about dealing with immoral people who are sinning, we're talking about people who claim to be Christians, who say they're one of us. Okay? Who are intentionally doing that. And he reinforces this point by saying that if an unbeliever asks you to go out to eat, just eat whatever. It doesn't matter. And the context there is, you could not buy meat probably in Corinth that wasn't sacrificed to an idol. Every butcher shop was basically the back door of a pagan shrine. Like, that's the way it was. And so technically eating that meat was participating in pagan worship. But Paul says, there's no such thing as those idols, those pagan gods. They don't exist. It's just meat. eat it. It doesn't matter unless they take it as you participating in pagan worship, or you can't do it without feeling like you're participating in pagan worship. So the idea here is that he's saying treat outsiders with respect, with dignity, and don't expect them to have the same standards you do as a Christian. So that's number one. What we're talking about today is not for people who aren't Christians. We're talking about people who claim to be Christians, okay? And then let's get to Matthew 18. This is where Jesus himself spells out how we deal with this. And this is something that every Christian should almost have memorized. How does this process work? Because Jesus spells this out black and white. He didn't spell a lot of things out in black and white. He didn't say this is exactly how you should do things in a lot of places. He says, look at the spirit of the law. Look at the purpose. Look at the situation. What's the heart? What is the principle here? Here, he's just like, here's the purpose. Here's how you do it, black and white. So if he's this blunt about it, we should probably know what he says, all right? Especially in a topic like this. And so he says in verse 15 of Matthew 18, he says, if another disciple sins against you, go and have it out just between the two of you. Okay, so step one. For this situation that we're dealing with, people teaching wrong things or people living intentionally in sin, go and talk to them one-on-one. Go deal with it. It's amazing how many problems get solved when people just go and talk it out. Like, it's nuts. It's crazy. So step one is just go talk it out. Go have it out. Now, the goal is restoration. Right? That's the goal here, that they become part of the family again in full membership, that they have right theology, that they are no longer living in intentional sin. That's the goal. It's not you're right, they're wrong, right? That does nothing. And it won't do anything. It won't fix anything. I'll tell you that right now from firsthand experience. Go talk to them one-on-one with that goal. Be patient, be kind, have it out. If you need to yell, whatever. But the point is, that's the goal. So step one, go talk to them. Continues on, it says, if they listen to you, you've won back a brother or sister. But if they won't listen, you should take with you one or two others so that everything may be established from the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses. So, step one, go talk to them one-on-one. Doesn't work? Go grab 2 or 3 witnesses. Why? That way it's not your word against theirs. Like, that's the point. And it's going to play a big role in the next step. If you have 2 or 3 other people that were there and they can be like, listen, no, you're wrong. Like, they may listen to more than one person. It's no longer just your opinion. It's at least the opinion of 2 or 3 other people. That, hey, this is not good theology. This is putting you outside the family of Christ. Hey, this is sin. You're living in intentional sin. The Bible says this. Do it patiently. Do it kindly. But the point is, you're doing it the right way. Okay? So he continues on. He says, and if they won't listen to them, tell it to the assembly, tell it to the congregation, tell it to the church. And if they won't listen to the assembly, you should treat such a person like you would a Gentile or a tax collector. Now, there's a cultural thing going on here. You and I we may not like tax collectors, but we're not like going to treat them as backstabbers. Our tax collectors are just doing a job. Tax collectors back then were Israelites, were Jewish people from that place who were basically crippling their family, their friends, their neighbors, their countrymen with tax debt so that they could get rich. Like the Romans would say, for example, you need to collect $2,000 from every person. The tax collector would go and collect $3,000 and keep the extra 1,000 per person. It was scummy, and everybody knew that's what they were doing. So they did not have anything to do with tax collectors. They were supporting their Roman oppressors, and they were doing it at the cost of every relationship in their life. So, yeah. And then the Gentiles, Jesus was teaching pre-resurrection, pre-death. And so after that, everybody, Gentiles, non-Jewish folks, were included into God's family. They were offered the invitation too. At this point, he was talking to an exclusively Jewish audience probably, and they all understood what this meant, right? Jewish people were not allowed to have anything to do with non-Jewish folks. They might have a working business relationship, but that's it. They could not be friends with them. They could not go and, like eat at their house even. Like they couldn't go in there. Like there was no contact. There was no, other than business relationships basically with Gentiles and Jewish folks. And so what he's saying is, you don't have anything to do with them. And he continues on and he says, basically, if you hold this together, it'll be held together in heaven. Like God will honor this if you're doing it right. And, it's done in the way he says, and which tangent. That's why verse 20 says, where two or three come together in my name, I will be in the midst of them. That does not mean that you have to have two people together to have Jesus' presence. I'll fill you in on a big old secret. That's not a secret at all. Every Christian has Jesus in them. He dwells within you. The Holy Spirit dwells within you. You don't need two or three people to gather together, right? What this is saying is that it takes two or three people to bear proper witness against someone, okay? So that's all I'd say. But anyways, back on topic. So Jesus spells it out. Go talk to him one-on-one. If that doesn't work, go talk to him with two or three people, so it's not your word versus theirs. Then go talk to him before the congregation. And this does happen. I know of churches where this has happened. It usually doesn't because people just chicken out or don't want to face that and they just leave. But the reality is this does happen. And it's hard, but it has to happen because remember, what's at stake here? Eternity. This person is living in a way that when Judgment Day happens, they do not go to be part of God's people to spend eternity in the place he created for them as in his presence. That won't happen for them. They spend eternity in the other place, in hell. That's high stakes. So this is hard, but it needs done, and we need to know how to do it. And so that gets us back to what John says. In verse 9, he says, anyone who goes out on their own and does not abide in the teaching of the Messiah does not have God. One who abides in the teaching of the Messiah, such a one has the Father and the Son. If anyone comes to you and does not bring this teaching, don't receive them into the house. Don't even give them a greeting. Anyone who utters a greeting to such a person shares in their wicked deeds. John and Jesus both say have nothing to do with that person. Seems a little harsh, right? Like, why is this so harsh? Why does it seem like we have to shun the non-believer? And again, it's not the non-believer. It's the person who claims to be a believer but is either living in intentional sin or teaching false doctrine. What does this mean? Why would they be so harsh? Well, you have to know the context here. First off, hospitality was huge in their culture. Like even like normal people, poor people, if they build a house with an extra room specifically for being hospitable, for having guests. Hospitality was everything. And when somebody came and they stayed with you, they ate dinner with you, they became associated with you. And there was a lot more of a you approve of this person kind of thing happen, right? You are giving credence to what they believe, to who they are. If somebody came to your house and stayed with you, you are telling the world, this person I support. Now, again, remember, that's different from dealing with non-Christians. Jesus hung out with sinners, right? Jesus said he came to save the sick and the lost. He came with people who did not know him, who did not follow God. You know, he went to the Pharisees' houses. Like, he went to the people who were far from God. We're not talking about those people. We're talking about people who claim to be part of God and are teaching it wrong or living in intentional sin. And so what we need to look at here is more along the lines of what can we do or what can't we do that will say we give credence to what they teach, right? That's what we're looking at here. That's the point. That's the spirit of this. It's not don't have anything to do with them. That seems contrary to the end result. The end result is reconciliation, that they get back within right belief, or they stop intentionally sinning. You can't just isolate from that person. However, you have to be intentional about what you do with them or what you don't do with them so that you don't give credence to their actions, all right? Association was taken as approval. That's why John uses such a harsh language. He says, don't even give them a greeting. If you greet somebody back then, it was you are associating with them. You are giving approval to them, right? Remember, Israelites and Gentiles didn't even greet one another. They don't do it. Only Jews greeted Jews. That's the context we're talking about. It's about giving credence to what they believe or what they're doing. And so the goal here is to get them back on track, is to get them where they need to be. And that sometimes means being harsh. But, you know, if a house is on fire, the kindest thing you can do is scream and yell and drag the person out by their foot so that they don't burn down with the house. That's the stakes here. And so in today's context, it may mean that so-and-so doesn't get to sing at your church, or so-and-so doesn't get to preach at your church, or teach a Sunday school class, or lead a small group. Like that's what we're talking about. So-and-so doesn't get to work or volunteer anywhere. Like they can come, they can sit, and they can believe and do what they want. and claim to be Christian, but they know they are outside the fellowship. It has been explained to them. It's gone one-on-one, several people, and then before the congregation. They don't have to stop attending your church, but they're no longer allowed to be in any position that says what they teach and what they believe or what they are doing is correct. You cannot give them any kind of credence. That's what we're talking about here. That means you have to pay attention to who you send your money to when you support these TV ministries or these YouTube ministries or these foreign missionaries. You got to make sure that you're giving money, you're supporting groups that teach right doctrine. Doesn't mean you agree with them on everything, because even people who go to the same church don't agree on everything, but the things that are essential, you have to agree on this, and they have to not be living in intentional sin. Intentional sin. Make sure you hear that. I'm not saying like they mess up or they have an addiction, they struggle, they realize, like, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about people who are intentionally not trying, who are intentionally aiming for the wrong standards. Hopefully this clears up some stuff. Hopefully this helps you understand this very complicated and difficult subject a little bit better. If you have more questions or just want to talk about this some more, by all means reach out to me, text, email, phone call, Facebook, whatever. All my information is on tollsborochristian.org. I'd love to chat with you. Otherwise, we'll see you next week.